Well, this will be an interesting discussion. We would be discussing the Constitution of India, which is in the framework of political, social, and economic democracy. The very fact that the Constitution of Indian Republic is a product not of political revolution, but of the research and deliberations of a body of eminent representatives of the people who ought to improve upon the existing system of administration makes this an interesting constitution. Constitution of India was framed by learned personalities who debated a lot and came up with a blueprint of what is known as Constitution of India. They did some 3 years of research, 3 years of deliberations, 3 years of debate, and finally agreed upon what is known as the Constitution of India. So let us have a look of the philosophy of this Constitution of India, and I would be focusing on these three primary aspects of democracy, namely the political democracy, the social democracy, and economic democracy. Our Constitution has a legacy from the pre-independence era. I would be tracing this constitutional evolution from 1858. And why 1858? Because this was the year in which the Constitution of India was enacted by the British government, by the imperial power. And you know the contest. You know that in 1857, there was a struggle for Indian independence, which the Indian rulers waged against the British East India Company. And though the Britishers crushed this War of Independence, as it is known as, of 1857, but the power was transferred from the East India Company to the British Parliament. And it was now decided that India would be ruled directly by the British Parliament and the British Crown. So the act which did that is called as the Government of India Act 1858, and that could be called as the oldest constitution of the modern Indian epoch. And that obviously was not our constitution because it was not framed by our people. It was the Constitution of India by imperial power, the British Crown, with absolutely no power to the Indian people. It was the constitution which was passed by the British Parliament. So then why do we discuss this? We need to discuss this because it is an interesting story as to how this act finally was modified, not willingly, but because of the struggle of the Indian people to make this constitution more participative. And finally, once we got independence in 1947, and when we had our own Constitution Assembly, which framed our own constitution, that was the ultimate success for the Indian people. So when 26th January 1950, when this Constitution of Independent India was adopted, that was adopted by the free people, free Indian people, with the power to entirely with the Indian people, Indian Parliament, and this whole entire process was really participatory. The debate was open, and there was a lot of deliberations, which ultimately is what we can say about the Constitution as it was now our Constitution, our people. So how did this happen, and what was the Government of Act 1858? This Government of India Act 1858, which was the Indian Constitution, but given by the Britishers. This act was the act which had the primary feature of centralization. As I said, this act has a context of the freedom struggle of 1857. And as I said, this was the act which was the act by the imperial power, the British Crown, with no power to the Indian people. So what was that act? So this act gave us a ruler in the form of Secretary of State for India, who was to be in England and who is to govern this Indian colony from the England's perspective, from the Britishers' perspective. India was a colony and it was to be governed by the Secretary of State for India, not from India, but from England. Now, this governance was to be through an appointed officer, namely the Governor General in India. And this Governor General in India was a supremo. He was not a democratically elected prime minister as we have now. He was the supremo with all the authority, the civil authority, the military authority, the executive authority, legislative assembly, everything was in his hands. He was the supremo, and that made this constitution of 1858 highly undemocratic. Not only undemocratic, but also undemocratic in the larger sense that it was the constitution of the colony, for a colony. The essential features of this constitution was the administration of the country was not only unitary, but rigidly centralized. Though the territories was divided into provinces with governor or lieutenant governor, aided by executive council as the head of each of them, these provisional governments were merely the agents of the government of India, and they were to function under the superintendence, direction, and control of the Governor General in all matters. There was no separation of functions, as I said, and all the power was concentrated in the hands of Governor General in the Council. The control of the Secretary of State over the Indian administration was absolute. And as I said, he sat in England, but he controlled the Indian administration. This act vested in him the total control not only of the revenues, but all of the operations. And he yielded the Indian administration, the last word was his, whether it was a matter of policy or of details. The entire machinery of British administration was bureaucratic, totally unconcerned about the public opinion in India. So that was what was the British Constitution of 1858. Now we need to understand that though this was the British Constitution 1858, but I just want to have a quick remembrance of some interesting ideas. And these interesting ideas you won't get when we read a history textbook or a textbook on the Constitution of India. As a matter of fact, if you look at the year in which sati was banned, you know that sati was a very bad practice where the women, the brides were burned when the husbands died, especially from those from a royal family. This practice was banned in India in 1829. You must also note that 1848 was the year when the social reformer Savitribai Phule started the first school for the girls. And interestingly, 1856 was the year. 1856 means just a year before the War of Independence, the struggle for independence was waged against the British government. 1856, the widows were allowed remarriages. So all these things happened under the East India Company rule. So we say that yes, it was the Britishers who were exploitative, and they were. But we also need to set this in a different context when there were simultaneously some reforms in the Indian society, and that is what we would be calling as social democracy. So when we look at these aspects of independence, we need to not simply focus on the independence of the Indian people from the British government, but we also need to focus on the independence of the Indian people, even from the tyranny of the Indian people, especially because of some very, very bad practices which were there. The caste system, the orthodoxy, all these things were there, and those things also mattered because of Britishers' own interests. They made certain laws which ultimately were also a sort of reforms for the Indian people, the common Indian people, I mean to say. So this also needs to be understood. Now, what was the philosophy of the Indian Constitution? However, freedom fighters, especially the learned people who led our Indian freedom struggle and who were responsible for framing the Constitution, what was their philosophy? That has to be understood. So, in 1946, which is 9th December to be precise, 9th December 1946, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru gave a very interesting speech to the Constituent Assembly, and that we should look at it as a philosophy of Indian Constitution. So what were the rulers, what were the ruling class thinking about when they started to frame our Constitution? What was the philosophy behind them? What was their way of thinking? So that is a very interesting take. So what did he say? He said that the first task of the Constituent Assembly is to free India through a new constitution. And look at it, how sensitive this sentence is. He is saying that it is to free India through new constitution. Free not from the British yoke, but then what? To feed the starving people, to clothe the naked masses. Means basically, kapda makan, roti kapda makan, that is what we say in Hindi. Okay, so the same thing is saying that way, to feed the starving people, to clothe the naked masses, and to give every Indian the fullest opportunity to develop himself according to his capacity. So this is certainly a great task. That is what he's saying to the Constituent Assembly. And in 1946, he's saying that look at India today. And that was the context when there was communal strife in India. There were there was a time when India was to be partitioned into India and Pakistan, okay, and the religious strife, there was communal disturbances and all that, and he was speaking in that context. So what he's saying, look at India today. We are sitting here, and there is a despair in many places and unrest in many cities. What is saying? Look at this. The atmosphere is surcharged with these quarrels and fears, which are called communal disturbances. And unfortunately, we sometimes cannot avoid them. But at present, the greatest and the most important question in India is how to solve the problem of the poor, how to solve the problem of the starving people. And that's what he said, that whenever we turn, we are confronted with this problem. If we cannot solve this problem soon, all our paper constitutions will become useless and purposeless. So he had this in mind, that the Indian constitution should be framed keeping in mind the welfare of the common people. And that was his philosophy when he said at the speech to the Constituent Assembly that keeping this aspect in view, who would suggest to us to postpone and wait? Okay, so that is what he said. And very interesting, very sensitive speech about, and which sums up one of the important aspect of Indian Constitution about the caring for the poor. Okay. Another very important ideas which was from Nehru, he gave in the form of objective resolution to the Constituent Assembly, and that was in Jan 22, 1947. So what were the main features of this objective resolution? and that would, in a way, some of the ideas or the philosophy of the Indian Constitution. So what was it? It was like the focus should be on sovereignty to the people. It means ultimately the people would be responsible for the Constitution. The people would be the supremos and not the government. Okay, so the ultimate power has to be derived from the people, not from anybody else. Okay? It has not to become from England. It has not to come from anywhere else. It has to rest with the people. That was the important thing. The second thing was he talked about the guarantee to be given to the people about the justice, and he mentions three justice: the political justice, the social justice, and the economic justice. He talks about not only justice, but he also focuses on the equality of status, no higher and no lower up in the caste structure, nobody higher up and lower up in terms of economical background. He talks about the equality of opportunity, rich and poor, everybody should get an opportunity, irrespective of the hierarchy in the caste structure. Equality before the law, and the freedom, of course. So, freedom of thought, the freedom to express oneself, freedom to embrace any belief, any religion, or even atheism, whatever we want, we must have the freedom to embrace the belief. So this is one of the important resolution about the Constitution. Then there was to be a safeguard for minorities, and this you need to understand that there was a lot of strife in the country. There was a worry about the security of the minorities like Muslims and Christians, and there was also the concern, especially from the backwards, from the tribals, about what would be their place in the Indian society because they were exploited, and what would be the future for them. So the safeguards for minorities, backwards and tribal areas were to be assured in the Indian Constitution. So that is how the Indian Constitution has to be framed. That is what Nehru said to the Constituent Assembly. Integrity of the territory, because you know that it was a time when the princes, they wanted to liberate themselves from India. There were some areas like Hyderabad, Jammu and Kashmir, where the territorial integrity was at stake. And hence the focus was to maintain the integrity of the territory. Okay, so that was also one of the aim objective of the Indian Constitution, that is, we need to be united as a country. And he also had a global vision about ultimately, which was spelled in his vision of non-alignment. Okay, but that vision was always there about global peace, international solidarity, that was also to be reflected in the Indian Constitution. So these were his ideas when he spoke in front of the Constituent Assembly on January 22, 1947. Very, very interesting speech. And then you see that all this are beautifully expressed in what is known as a preamble of the Constitution. So what does the preamble of the Constitution say? It says that we the people of India, look at this. He's not saying that we the ruling class or we whatever. He is saying we the people of India. So the ultimate sovereignty is with the people of India. We the people of India have given us the Constitution. So nobody else has given us the Constitution. We ourselves have given us the Constitution. And what is that Constitution? To be a sovereign country, to be a socialist country, to be a secular country, to be a democratic country, to be a republic country. All these terms are heavily weighted. Okay, what is the meaning of secular, socialist, democratic, republic? All this has their own meanings, and we'll be discussing those in our series of lectures. Okay. Then he talked the preamble, which is a preamble of the Constitution, the philosophy of the Constitution, says that we need to secure to all its citizens the justice, not only the political justice, but also social justice, economic justice, as well as political justice. Then it talked about liberty, especially when certain countries were giving lot of equality, but there was an issue of liberty to the common people. So liberty was also an important element in the Indian Constitution. And this liberty was of thought, liberty to express oneself, liberty to profess any faith or not to profess any faith, liberty to worship or not to worship. Okay, so that was the liberty, kind of liberty talk about. And the equality of status to and an equality of opportunity to promote among them the dignity of the individual, okay, and the unity and integrity of the nation. So all these aspects very neatly tells us the philosophy of the Indian Constitution, especially with respect to the political, economical, and social democracy. And this Constitution Assembly in 1949 adopted this. On November 1949, this preamble and the Constitution was adopted. And finally, you know that it came into force on 26th Jan 1950, on the day which we celebrate what is known as the Republic Day. Okay, there were certain amendments, especially the 42nd Amendment, wherein explicitly we declared ourselves as socialist and secular. Though these terms were inserted in this Constitution of Indian preamble, but we need to keep in mind that always the policymakers had these terms, socialist and secular, in the back of mind, and that would be clear when you see the speeches of the people or the debates. If you read the debates in the Constitution Assembly about it. And Nehru again, when he talked about political democracy in 1956 February, he said that, and this is very interesting take on political democracy. So we generally understand political democracy as a right to vote. Okay, every citizen can vote if he's an adult, right? So that is what we understand by political democracy. But that was not how Pandit Nehru looked on about or talked about political democracy. So what is political democracy according to Nehru? So he says that democracy has been spoken of cheaply in the past as political democracy, roughly represented by every person having a vote. Okay, but, and that is very important, but a vote by itself does not represent very much to a person who is down and out, to a person who is starving or hungry. So that is his vision. Look at this. What is he saying? He's saying that vote by itself does not represent very much. So we should not be very much proud that we have been, citizens have been given vote. Okay, they need to be given food. They need to be given equality. Okay, so this political democracy by itself is not enough, except that it may be used to obtain a gradually increasing measure of economic democracy. And now he brings in this term called as economic democracy. He brings in these terms called as equality and the spread of good things to life, to others, and to remove the gross inequality. So this is the vision of the Indian Constitution, right? So not enough simply to get the right to vote. Citizens should get the right to equality, right to have an economic democracy, and right to get good things of life. Okay, and there should be a reduction in the gross inequalities. So equality itself is the vision of the Indian Constitution. Another doyen who was responsible for writing the Indian Constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, he has a very interesting speech on 25th November 1949. He said, and this is very, very inspiring. It talks about what we are, what we were in 1949, and what was the direction the Indian Constitution set before us, the blueprint before us. So he says that on 26th January 1950, we are going to enter into the life of contradictions. And what does he say? In politics, we will have equality. So that is what he says, that we will have political democracy in 1950s. We will have equality. That is, everybody would have a right to vote. And in economic life, we will have inequality. That is what he says, that there would be an absence of economic democracy. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social structure and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. So how long shall we continue to live with these contradictions? How long shall we deny our citizens the social democracy and economic democracy? How long we would continue to deny equality in our social and economic life? And that is then he issues a warning to us that if we continue to deny this social democracy and economic democracy for long, we will do so only by putting our political democracy in danger, in peril. So, if the Indian democracy has to flourish, if the political democracy has to survive, then there is no alternative but to bring in the social democracy and economic democracy, according to Dr. Ambedkar, and also according to Nehru. We must remove this contradiction at the earliest possible moment. So he is saying that at the earliest we should bring in social democracy and economic democracy. He's not saying how. Okay, that has to be ultimately decided by democratic politics. But he's saying that we need to remove this contradiction. We need to remove the suffering from which arises because of inequality. Those who suffer from inequality otherwise will blow up the structure of political democracy, and that is not acceptable because we had labored a lot in writing this constitution. So that is what Dr. Ambedkar told when he spoke in the Constituent Assembly after finishing writing this the Constitution of India. And what he had in mind about the social democracy, with this we would be ending our lecture today. So what is the social democracy? What does social democracy actually mean? So it means that it is a way of life which recognizes not only equality, mind well, it also recognizes liberty and fraternity as principles of life. And you see that this liberty, equality, fraternity, these are the principles which were brought forth by the French Revolution. Okay, so that is what he had in mind, Dr. Ambedkar had in mind when he kept on stressing these principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Those principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity are not to be treated as separate atoms. They are not the separate atoms, but they are the one. They are the form of union in trinity. So in that sense, to divorce one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. So he's saying that we cannot have one kind of democracy and we cannot have the other, and there are no other democracies that won't do. So we cannot have simply equality or simply liberty or simply fraternity. We need to have liberty, equality, and fraternity simultaneously. That is what he says. So liberty cannot be divorced from equality, equality cannot be divorced from liberty, nor can liberty and equality be divorced from fraternity. Without equality, and equality is very important for him, liberty would produce the supremacy of the few over the many, and this few people would rule the country, and there won't be a real democracy. If you simply get equality, just distribute the resources, but people are not given liberty, then that would kill the individual initiative. And people will not have the freedom. If the people don't lack the freedom, then they won't be doing individually as a people. They would not be acting. They would be acting. They would be forced upon to act. Okay, that is not tolerable. So government should not force the people to act. Even for equality, it should be equality with liberty. And if that happens, then very few people with power, political power, would kill the liberty, and again there would be a supremacy. Without fraternity, liberty, and equality could not become a natural course of things. So we need to have a fraternity, brotherhood, right? It would require, otherwise, if there is no fraternity, we'll have to have some police action to enforce liberty and equality. So that cannot happen. So we must begin by acknowledging the fact that And when he was said that, he said that there is a complete absence of two things in Indian society. One of this is equality. On the social plane, we have in India society based on graded inequality, the caste system. That is what he was talking about. Graded inequality, the caste system which we have in society, with very few people having immense wealth and most of the people living in abject poverty. So if we want to remove that, we need to bring in the social equality, social democracy. So this was about the philosophy of Indian Constitution, especially the discussion about the social democracy, the economic democracy, and political democracy, and very interesting discourse by our leaders, the people who contributed in framing the Indian Constitution.